Welcome to Quietly Made. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight. This is a space for the curious and the weary, a place where we explore the vast, invisible infrastructures of our world, while giving your mind the permission it needs to simply rest. Before we begin, I invite you to join our community by subscribing and leaving a comment. I often wonder where these stories find you tonight. If you feel inclined, please leave a comment sharing what part of the world you are in and the hour you are settling into sleep. It is a small way for us to feel the quiet connection of this community, scattered across different time zones, but sharing this same moment of rest. If you fall asleep, that is exactly what should happen. You are safe here. You can always come back tomorrow and pick up exactly where you left off. Adjust your pillow. Take a deep, slow breath in and let it out. Let your mind drift as we begin. Tonight, we turn our attention to the quiet assembly of the printing press, to the smell of oil-based ink and the rhythmic clack of metal type being set into frames, to the craftsman who carved letters in reverse, who understood that pressure applied evenly could transfer an image from metal to paper, who saw in this mechanical process something that would reshape how knowledge moved through the world. This is not a story of instant enlightenment. It is a story of incremental refinement, of alloys tested and rejected, of presses that cracked under pressure, of ink that smeared or faded. It is a story written in the language of metallurgy and chemistry, in the creak of wooden screws and the whisper of paper being pressed against inked type. We begin not with books, but with a question that lingered in workshops for generations. How do you make many identical copies of something without copying it by hand? Before the press, there was the scribe, hunched over parchment in monastery cells, squinting in candlelight, copying letter by letter, word by word, page by page. A single book might take months. A library of a few hundred volumes represented years of accumulated labor. The work demanded extraordinary patience. A moment's distraction could introduce an error. A spilled inkwell could destroy weeks of progress. The scribes developed rituals, techniques for maintaining focus, for keeping their hands steady through hours of repetitive motion. They mixed their own inks from soot and gum Arabic, adjusting consistency by feel, by experience. Too thick, and the ink clogged the quill. Too thin, and it bled through the parchment. The recipe was never written down. It lived in the hands, in the muscle memory of craftsmen who had mixed ink for decades. Parchment itself was expensive, made from animal skins, sheep, goat, calf. Each sheet represented the hide of one animal, scraped and stretched and treated until it was thin enough to write on, but durable enough to last. A single book might require dozens of animals. The cost was measured not just in money, but in the agricultural capacity needed to raise livestock for their skins. Some texts were copied onto paper, a technology that arrived from the East through trade routes. Paper was cheaper than parchment, made from rags and plant fibers beaten into pulp, spread thin, and dried. It was more fragile, more prone to damage from moisture, but it could be produced in greater quantities at lower cost. Still, whether on parchment or paper, copying remained slow, laborious, prone to error. Each copy was unique, bearing the subtle variations introduced by the scribe's hand, by fatigue, by misreading the source text. And yet, this system produced magnificent works, illuminated manuscripts with elaborate decorations, with gold leaf applied one flake at a time, with miniature paintings so detailed they required magnification to fully appreciate. These were not mass-produced items. They were singular creations, each one a collaboration between scribe, illustrator, and binder. But for most texts, legal documents, religious texts, instructional manuals, the artistry was unnecessary. What was needed was accuracy and volume, a way to produce many copies quickly, identically, without the endless hours of manual transcription. The insight that changed everything was simple, almost obvious in hindsight. If you could create a reversed image of text in a durable material, you could ink it and press it against paper, transferring the image. Do this once, you have a copy. Do it 1,000 times, you have 1,000 identical copies. The concept was not entirely new. Woodblock printing had been used for centuries, particularly in Asia. An artisan would carve an entire page of text into a block of wood, cutting away the negative space, leaving the letters raised. The block could then be inked and pressed onto paper, creating a printed page. But woodblocks had limitations. Each block could print only one specific page. A book required as many blocks as it had pages. The carving was painstaking, and once a block was carved, its content was fixed. Correcting an error meant carving a new block. What was needed was a system of movable components, individual letters that could be arranged, rearranged, used again in different combinations. The letters themselves would need to be durable, identical, and precise enough that they would align properly when assembled. Metal was the answer. Cast in molds, metal type could be produced in quantity, each letter identical to every other instance of that letter. The type could be arranged into words, lines, pages, then disassembled and reused for different texts. The technical challenges were considerable. The metal had to be hard enough not to deform under pressure, soft enough to cast cleanly, stable enough not to corrode or oxidize. Different alloys were tested. Lead was too soft. Iron was too hard, too difficult to cast with precision. Tin had promise, but was expensive. The solution was an alloy, lead mixed with tin and antimony. The antimony gave the alloy hardness, reduced shrinkage during cooling. The tin improved flowability, allowing the molten metal to fill the fine details of the mold. Lead provided weight and economy. The molds themselves required precision. Each letter had to be exactly the same height, measured from the face that would touch the paper to the base that would rest in the composing frame. Variations of even a fraction of a millimeter would cause uneven printing, some letters pressing harder than others, creating dark and light spots on the page. Creating the molds began with cutting punches, steel rods with letters carved in relief on one end. The punch cutter worked with files and gravers, shaping each letter by hand, checking proportions, ensuring legibility. The work required artistic skill and meticulous precision. A lowercase e might be only a few millimeters tall, yet every curve, every opening had to be perfect. Once the punch was complete, it was hardened through heating and quenching, transforming the steel into a tool capable of stamping its shape into softer metal. The punch was then struck into a block of copper or brass, creating a matrix, a negative impression of the letter. The matrix was fitted into a hand mold, a device that could be opened and closed with the matrix at the bottom. Molten type metal was poured into the mold, filling the space around the matrix. The metal cooled rapidly, solidifying in seconds. The mold was opened, the type removed, and the process repeated. A skilled caster could produce hundreds of pieces of type in a day, each one nominally identical. But perfection was elusive. Tiny variations accumulated. The molds wore slightly with each use. The temperature of the metal varied, affecting shrinkage. Each piece of type had to be examined, measured, the defective ones discarded. Setting type was its own craft. The compositor stood before a case, a wooden tray divided into compartments, each holding a different letter or symbol. The layout of the case was standardized, capital letters in the upper sections, lowercase in the lower sections. This is the origin of those terms, uppercase and lowercase. The compositor held a composing stick, a small metal frame with adjustable width. Reading from the manuscript, they selected letters one by one, placing them in the stick in reverse order, right to left. The type itself was reversed, a mirror image of the letter it would print. Spacing between words was achieved with blank pieces of type, quads and spacers of various widths. Spacing between lines used thin strips of lead, hence the term leading. The compositor judged spacing by eye, adjusting to create even, readable text. Once a line was set, it was transferred to a galley, a larger tray that held multiple lines. When enough text was assembled to fill a page, it was transferred to a chase, a metal frame that held the type locked together. Wooden or metal furniture filled the empty spaces around the text, creating pressure that held everything in place. The locked chase was then placed on the bed of the press, a flat surface where the type would be inked and pressed against paper. But before printing could begin, the type had to be adjusted. Make ready, this process was called. Thin pieces of paper were placed under sections of type that printed too lightly, raising them slightly. Type that printed too darkly might be lowered, or the pressure reduced in that area. This make ready was an art requiring judgment and patience. A good pressman could look at a proof sheet and know exactly where adjustments were needed, how much to raise or lower each section. Poor make ready resulted in uneven printing, some letters bold, others barely visible. The ink was not ordinary writing ink. It had to be thick enough to adhere to metal type, fluid enough to spread evenly, fast drying enough not to smear when the paper was removed, yet slow enough not to dry on the type between impressions. Oil-based inks met these requirements. Linseed oil mixed with soot or lampblack, sometimes with resins or varnishes added to adjust properties. The mixture was ground on a stone slab with a muller. a process that could take hours, reducing the pigment particles to a fine consistency. The ink was applied to the type using leather balls, pads stuffed with wool and covered with soft leather. The pressman would dab the balls into the ink, then pat them across the surface of the type, coating it evenly. The motion was rhythmic, practiced, ensuring that every letter received ink without flooding the recessed areas. Later, rollers replaced the leather balls, cylinders of leather or composition material that could be rolled across the type, depositing ink more quickly and evenly. But the principle remained the same. Coat the raised surface with a thin, uniform layer of ink. Paper was laid on the inked type, either by hand or using a tympan, a frame covered with parchment that held the paper in position. The bed of the press was then slid under the platen, a flat plate that would apply pressure. The pressman pulled a lever or turned a screw, bringing the platen down onto the paper with tremendous force. The pressure had to be sufficient to transfer ink from type to paper, but not so great as to damage the paper or deform the type. Too little pressure left the impression faint. Too much caused the ink to squash out around the letters, creating a blurred edge. The pressure was released. The bed was slid out. The paper was removed, now bearing the printed image. The process repeated, again and again, hour after hour, day after day. The rhythm of the press became the heartbeat of the workshop. The clack of the platen striking, the scrape of the bed moving, the rustle of paper being laid and removed. These sounds marked time, measured productivity, filled the air of printing houses across continents. The physical labor was demanding. The pressman's arm grew strong from pulling the lever, from applying force hundreds or thousands of times per day. The compositor's fingers developed calluses from handling type. The ink maker's hands were perpetually stained black, the pigment working into the whorls of their fingerprints. The workshop smelled of ink and paper, of metal and oil. Dust from paper fibers hung in the air, caught in shafts of sunlight from high windows. The type cases accumulated a fine layer of grime, a mixture of ink residue and metal particles worn from the type. Organizing a printing house required capital and skill. The press itself was expensive, a massive wooden or iron structure. The type represented a significant investment. Thousands of pieces needed to set multiple pages simultaneously. Paper had to be purchased in quantity. Ink had to be mixed in batches. Workers had to be paid. The economics worked only at scale. A scribe copying one book at a time could charge accordingly. A printer producing hundreds of copies had to sell enough to recoup the setup costs, the time spent composing and making ready before profit began. This drove printers towards certain types of work: religious texts with large, predictable demand, legal documents that every court needed, educational materials used by students, books in Latin, the common language of the educated across Europe, ensuring a market beyond any single city or region. But the press also enabled new types of publication. Pamphlets could be printed quickly, responding to current events, to controversies, to public interest. Broadsides, single sheets with news or announcements, could be produced in a day, and distributed immediately. The printed word became timely in a way manuscripts never were. The spread of printing followed trade routes and political networks. Printers moved between cities, seeking opportunity, fleeing restrictions, following patrons. They brought their knowledge with them. How to cut punches, how to cast type, how to mix ink, how to operate the press. Each printer added refinements. Different typeface designs emerged, some prioritizing legibility, others elegance. Page layouts varied, some dense with text, others using wide margins and generous spacing. Illustrations were added, first as woodcuts printed alongside type, later as engravings offering finer detail. The integration of images with text required coordination. The woodcut, or engraving, had to be the same height as the type, had to be locked into the chase alongside the text, had to be inked and printed in the same operation. The carvers who made these blocks were specialists, their skill distinct from that of the typecasters or compositors. Some images were printed separately on different paper or using different techniques, then bound into books alongside the printed text. This was common for elaborate illustrations, for maps, for scientific diagrams that required precision beyond what woodcuts could provide. The binding of printed sheets into books was yet another craft. The printed pages, usually printed on both sides of large sheets that were then folded, had to be assembled in the correct order, sewn together along the folds, attached to covers. Leather or cloth covered wooden boards, providing protection. The quality of binding varied enormously, from simple paper wrappers to elaborate covers with gold tooling and clasps. Errors in printed texts were inevitable. A compositor might select the wrong letter, might transpose characters, might skip a line. The type might shift during printing, causing misalignment. Ink might blob or fail to transfer cleanly. Proofreading became essential. Someone, often the compositor themselves or a specialized proofreader, would read the set type before printing, comparing it to the manuscript, marking corrections. The type would be adjusted, letters replaced, spacing corrected. But even after careful proofreading, errors persisted. Once sheets were printed, discovering an error meant making a decision. Reprint the entire run, wasting paper and labor, or accept the error, perhaps noting it in an errata sheet bound with the book. Some errors became permanent parts of printed works, propagated through edition after edition, because correcting them would require resetting type. Scholars learned to work with these imperfections, to note them in their own work, to compare different editions to identify where errors had been introduced or corrected. The very existence of identical copies made errors more consequential. A scribe's mistake affected only one manuscript. A printer's error appeared in every copy of that edition, potentially hundreds or thousands of books. This motivated greater care, more rigorous proofreading, but perfection remained elusive. The demand for printed material grew beyond what early printers anticipated. Literacy was expanding, not just among clergy and nobility, but among merchants, craftsmen, professionals. These readers wanted books in their own languages, not just Latin. They wanted practical information, how to navigate, how to calculate interest, how to treat diseases. Printers responded by publishing in vernacular languages. Grammars and dictionaries helped standardize these languages, establishing conventions for spelling and usage that had varied wildly in manuscript tradition. The printed word became a force for linguistic standardization, though regional variations persisted. Technical manuals appeared, describing processes that had previously been transmitted orally or kept secret. Blacksmithing, surveying, architecture, fortification. Skills that relied on apprenticeship could now be supplemented with printed instructions, diagrams, tables of measurements. Scientific texts benefited enormously from printing. Astronomical tables, previously copied by hand, with opportunities for error in every number, could now be printed identically in multiple copies. Botanical illustrations could be reproduced, allowing readers in different countries to identify the same plants. Mathematical notation could be standardized. The distribution of printed books created new infrastructure. Booksellers established shops, stocking works from multiple printers. Catalogs were printed and distributed, listing available titles, allowing readers to order books they had not seen. Trade fairs became venues for printers and booksellers to meet, to exchange inventory, to learn what was selling in different regions. Shipping books required care. They were heavy, valuable, susceptible to damage from moisture. They traveled in barrels or wrapped in oilcloth, moved by wagon or ship, sometimes crossing the entire continent. The logistics of book distribution became a business in itself, with specialists managing the flow of books from printers to sellers to readers. Piracy emerged as a concern. A printer in one city might acquire a popular book, reset the type, and print their own edition without compensating the original publisher. Copyright law did not yet exist in any meaningful form. The only protections were practical: the cost and effort of resetting type, the risk of selling an inferior product, the informal networks of printers who might refuse to deal with those who engaged in blatant copying. Some authorities granted privileges, monopolies on printing certain texts for a specified period. These were intended to encourage investment in expensive publications, to ensure quality, to provide revenue to the state through licensing fees. But they were also used to control information, to restrict who could print religious or political texts. Censorship became both easier and harder with printing. Easier because printed books were visible. Commercial enterprises that could be raided, their stock confiscated, their printers arrested. Harder because printed books multiplied faster than authorities could suppress them. Destroy one copy and hundreds might remain. Lists of prohibited books were compiled and published, ironically often printed themselves. Printers might be required to submit manuscripts for approval before printing, to mark their work with their name and location, to register titles with authorities. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. A book banned in one jurisdiction might be freely available across a border. Clandestine presses operated, producing prohibited texts, smuggling them to markets where they were in demand. The portable nature of the press, it could be moved, hidden, operated in secret, made complete suppression nearly impossible. Some printers became adept at navigating these restrictions. They would print innocuous texts openly while running prohibited materials at night. They would use false imprints, claiming the book was printed in a different city by a different printer. They would produce books with removable title pages, allowing the same text to be sold under different titles in different markets. The tension between the desire to control information and the economic incentives to print what would sell shaped the development of printing across its first centuries. Authorities adapted, creating more sophisticated systems of licensing and censorship. Printers adapted in turn, developing strategies to evade restrictions while minimizing risk. The technology of the press itself evolved slowly at first. The basic mechanism, a screw or lever applying pressure to bring a platen down onto a bed holding inked type, remained fundamentally unchanged for centuries. Improvements were incremental: stronger frames, smoother operation, better methods of inking. Iron presses replaced wooden ones, providing greater strength and precision. The metal could be machined to tighter tolerances, ensuring more even pressure. The frames were less likely to warp or crack under stress. The operation became faster, smoother, requiring less physical effort from the pressman. The Stanhope press, constructed entirely of iron, used a system of compound levers that multiplied the force applied by the pressman. This allowed printing larger forms with a single pull of the lever, reducing the time needed for each impression. Later, innovations introduced cylinders. Instead of a flat platen descending onto a flat bed, a cylinder could roll across the inked type, applying pressure progressively along its width. This allowed continuous motion, the bed moving under the cylinder rotating, the impression made in one smooth action rather than a reciprocating stop and start. Cylinder presses were faster, capable of producing more impressions per hour. They required different skills from the pressman, different timing, different judgment of pressure and ink. The transition from flatbed to cylinder was gradual, with both types coexisting for decades, each suited to different types of work. Steam power began to drive presses, replacing human muscle with mechanical force. A steam engine could maintain steady pressure, could run continuously without fatigue. The output of a steam-powered press exceeded what any hand-operated press could achieve. One press could do the work of 10, 20, 50 hand presses. But steam power required investment in the engine, in the space to house it, in fuel, in maintenance. Small printing shops continued to operate hand presses long after steam was available, serving local markets, producing work that did not justify the capital expenditure of mechanization. Typecasting also mechanized. Handcasting was slow, limited by the speed at which one person could pour metal, open the mold, remove the type. Machines were developed that automated this process, casting type continuously, faster and more uniformly than any hand caster. The linotype machine took this further, eliminating hand composition entirely. The operator typed on a keyboard, and the machine assembled matrices, the molds for letters, into lines. Molten metal was poured, creating a solid line of type, a slug. The matrices were automatically returned to their magazines, ready to be used again. Composing text became as fast as typing. A skilled linotype operator could set type many times faster than a hand compositor. The slugs could be used for printing, then melted down, the metal reused. Type was no longer a permanent investment, but a consumable, cast fresh for each job. This changed the economics of printing again. The capital cost shifted from maintaining vast quantities of type to purchasing and maintaining linotype machines. Labor shifted from compositors selecting individual pieces of type to machine operators and specialized machinists who repaired the complex mechanisms. The monotype system offered a different approach. Text was typed on a keyboard that produced a punched paper tape. This tape controlled a separate casting machine that produced individual pieces of type automatically, arranged in the order specified by the tape. This allowed corrections to be made easily, adjust the tape, recast the affected type, without resetting an entire line. Both systems coexisted, each with advantages. Linotype was faster for straightforward text, for newspapers, for books with minimal corrections. Monotype offered flexibility, precision in spacing, the ability to produce type for hand composition when that was needed. The machines were marvels of mechanical engineering, thousands of parts working in coordination. Matrices sliding along tracks, metal flowing through channels, ejector mechanisms pushing finished type or slugs into place. They required constant adjustment, lubrication, cleaning. A skilled linotype mechanic was as valuable as the operator. Papermaking also industrialized. Hand papermaking, dipping a mold into pulp, shaking it to form a sheet, pressing and drying the sheets, was slow, limited in the size of sheets it could produce. Machine papermaking created continuous webs of paper, rolled onto cylinders, cut to size as needed. The Fourdrinier machine used a moving screen that carried pulp forward while water drained through. Rollers pressed the partially formed paper, removing more water. Drying cylinders, heated by steam, completed the process. The result was a continuous ribbon of paper, emerging from the machine at speeds measured in feet per minute. This paper was cheaper than handmade, produced in greater quantities, more uniform. But it lacked some qualities of handmade paper. The fibers were oriented in one direction, making the paper weaker across its width. The surface was smoother, sometimes too smooth, affecting how ink adhered. Different papers were developed for different purposes. Newsprint, cheap, short-lived, made from wood pulp ground mechanically. Book paper, stronger, whiter, made from chemical pulp that removed lignin, preventing yellowing. Fine papers for special editions, for documents, for uses where quality mattered more than cost. The paper industry became linked to forestry. Vast areas of woodland were harvested for pulp. Rivers were used to transport logs, to power mills, to discharge effluent from the pulping process. The environmental impact was significant, though little remarked upon at the time. Ink technology advanced in parallel. New pigments provided different colors: red, blue, green, expanding beyond the black that had dominated. Synthetic dyes offered colors brighter than natural pigments, though sometimes less permanent. The chemistry of ink became more sophisticated. Additives controlled drying time, viscosity, adhesion. Quick-drying inks allowed faster work, though they risked drying on the press. Slow-drying inks permitted more working time, but could smear if sheets were stacked before drying completely. Colored printing required multiple passes, one for each color, with the paper carefully registered to ensure colors aligned. The process was exacting. Misregistration of even a fraction of a millimeter was visible, creating colored fringes around images, text that appeared blurry or doubled. Some printers specialized in color work, developing techniques for achieving accurate registration, for mixing inks to achieve specific shades, for overprinting colors to create additional hues. The work was artistic as much as technical, requiring an eye for color, an understanding of how inks interacted. Lithography introduced a different approach to printing. Instead of raised type, the image was drawn with greasy crayon on a smooth limestone surface. The stone was wetted, then inked. The water repelled ink except where the greasy image had been drawn. Paper pressed against the stone transferred the ink. This process allowed printing of images that would be difficult or impossible with type or woodcuts. Continuous tone illustrations, fine gradations, artistic effects, all were possible with lithography. The technique was used for maps, for music, for art reproductions, for advertising posters. Lithographic stones were heavy, awkward to handle, limited in size. Eventually, zinc or aluminum plates replaced stone, lighter and easier to work with. The process became photolithography, where images were transferred photographically onto light-sensitive coatings on the plates, eliminating the need for artists to draw directly on the printing surface. Offset lithography added another step. The plate transferred the image to a rubber blanket, which then transferred it to paper. This indirect process reduced wear on the plate, allowed printing on rougher papers, reversed the image so the plate itself could carry a right-reading image. These developments expanded what could be printed, how quickly, at what cost. They also increased the complexity of printing operations, requiring different skills, different equipment, different materials. The printing house became a more diverse operation, with departments specializing in different processes. The social impact of printing cannot be overstated, though it unfolded over generations, often in ways that were not immediately apparent. The availability of identical texts allowed coordinated education. Students in different cities could study from the same books, preparing for examinations based on the same materials. Professional standards emerged, codified in printed manuals that practitioners across regions could reference. Medical knowledge, legal precedents, engineering practices, all became more standardized, more accessible, more subject to criticism and improvement because they were published, available for review. The printing of controversial texts sparked debates that would have remained local in an era of manuscripts. A theological argument printed in one city could be read and responded to in another. The response could be printed and distributed. The conversation became distributed, conducted through printed pamphlets and books rather than face-to-face debate. This acceleration of intellectual exchange is sometimes described as enabling later scientific and cultural developments, though the relationship is complex, indirect, mediated by countless other factors. What is clear is that printing changed the speed and scale at which ideas could spread, could be preserved, could be built upon. A scholar working on a problem could read what others had written, could cite their work, could identify where their own contribution fit into a larger body of knowledge. The cumulative nature of learning became more pronounced when each generation could build on a printed, accessible record of what came before. Newspapers emerged as a distinct form of printing, optimized for speed and volume. The news was perishable, valuable today, irrelevant tomorrow. This demanded rapid production, gathering information, setting type, printing, and distributing all within hours. The newspaper office operated on tight schedules. Stories arrived by telegraph, by courier, by reporters returning from assignments. Editors selected what to print, wrote headlines, determined layout. Compositors set type at speed, working from copy that might still be damp with ink. The press ran continuously during the print window, churning out thousands of copies. Pressmen monitored quality, adjusted as problems appeared, kept the machinery running despite heat, noise, vibration. Paper jams, ink problems, mechanical failures, all had to be addressed immediately, or the deadline would be missed. Distribution began even as printing continued. Bundles of papers were loaded onto wagons, onto trains, handed to newsboys who would sell them on street corners. The whole operation, from news gathering to papers in readers' hands, might span only a few hours. This pace shaped journalism itself. Stories had to be written quickly, in a style that conveyed information efficiently. The inverted pyramid structure, most important information first, details following, allowed stories to be cut from the bottom if space was short, without losing essential content. The economics of newspapers differed from books. Newspapers were cheap, disposable, intended for daily purchase rather than permanent ownership. Revenue came partly from sales, but increasingly from advertising. Merchants paid to have their messages printed alongside the news, reaching thousands of potential customers. This advertising revenue subsidized the news, allowing newspapers to be sold for less than production cost. But it also created dependencies, pressures. Advertisers had influence. Publishers had to balance editorial independence against commercial interests. Magazine printing followed different patterns. Magazines were not daily, but weekly or monthly, allowing more time for production, more attention to quality. They often used better paper, more illustrations, more sophisticated layouts than newspapers. The content was less time-sensitive, essays, fiction, analysis, rather than breaking news. This allowed for longer production cycles, for revisions, for editorial refinement. But it also meant magazines had to remain relevant over longer periods, had to offer value that persisted beyond the immediate moment. Subscription models developed where readers paid in advance for a series of issues. This provided publishers with steady revenue, with predictable circulation numbers that could be sold to advertisers. The subscriber list became a valuable asset, a defined audience with known characteristics. Printing magazines efficiently required long press runs, thousands or tens of thousands of copies to achieve economical per-unit costs. This favored publications with broad appeal, with content that could attract large audiences. Niche publications were economically challenging and less targeted to affluent readers willing to pay premium prices. Specialty printing developed for specific applications. Banknotes required security features, intricate engraving, special papers with embedded fibers, inks that were difficult to replicate. The printing was done on specialized presses by craftsmen trained in security printing, under conditions that prevented unauthorized access to plates or materials. Labels, packaging, advertisements used printing adapted to their needs. Die cutting shaped printed materials into non-rectangular forms. Embossing created raised text or images. Foil stamping applied metallic finishes. Each technique required specialized equipment, specialized knowledge. The printing industry fragmented into specializations. Commercial printers handled business cards, letterhead, forms. Book printers focused on longer runs, quality binding. Job printers did quick turnaround work, posters, flyers, programs. Each developed expertise in their niche, invested in appropriate equipment, cultivated relationships with specific types of clients. The globalization of printing followed colonial and commercial expansion. Presses were established in colonies, initially to print religious texts, government documents, commercial forms. Local languages began to be printed, standardizing spelling and grammar, creating written traditions where primarily oral cultures had existed. This was not a neutral process. Colonial authorities controlled what was printed, who could operate presses, what languages were prioritized. Indigenous knowledge traditions were sometimes preserved in print, but often filtered through colonial perspectives, translated by those who might not fully understand the source culture. Resistance movements used printing to spread their messages, to coordinate action, to build support. Pamphlets and newspapers in local languages fostered identity, articulated grievances, imagined alternatives to colonial rule. The authorities attempted to suppress such printing, but the technology had spread too widely, the knowledge too broadly distributed. In regions with established literary traditions, printing accelerated the production of texts in those traditions. Poetry, religious commentary, historical chronicles, works that had existed in manuscript could now be printed, reaching wider audiences. being preserved in multiple copies. The interaction between manuscript and print cultures was complex. Some societies embraced printing enthusiastically. Others remained attached to manuscript traditions, viewing handwritten texts as more authoritative, more beautiful, more worthy of respect. Print was sometimes seen as mechanical, lacking the human touch of the calligrapher's hand. Over time, these attitudes shifted. The economics were undeniable. Print was cheaper, faster, more accessible. Manuscript production continued for specialized purposes, for prestigious works, for personal correspondence. But the balance tipped decisively toward print for most functions. Printing shaped education at every level. Textbooks, standardized curricula, allowing teachers in different schools to follow the same course of instruction. Examination materials could be printed and distributed, ensuring consistency in assessment. Children's primers taught reading using printed books designed for learners. Illustrated alphabets, simple stories, graduated difficulty. These became possible at scale through printing. Literacy rates rose, though the causes were multiple, intertwined with broader social and economic changes. Universities relied on printed texts for instruction. Students could own books rather than relying solely on lectures, on notes copied from their teachers' manuscripts. They could study independently, could compare different authorities, could develop their own perspectives through reading. The lecture, which had partly functioned to transmit the content of rare manuscripts, evolved toward interpretation, discussion, examination of ideas, rather than mere transmission of information. The printed text became a common foundation that teacher and students both possessed. Libraries grew, their collections expanding far beyond what would have been possible in the manuscript era. Thousands of books could be housed, catalogued, made available to readers. The organization of knowledge itself became a field of study. How to categorize, how to create finding aids, how to preserve materials for future use. The preservation of knowledge became both easier and more complex with printing. Multiple copies meant that the loss of one did not destroy the text. Fire, flood, war might destroy one library, but the same books existed in other collections. Yet printed books also deteriorated. The paper, especially when made from wood pulp, became brittle over time. The acid in the paper broke down cellulose fibers, causing pages to brown, to crack, eventually to crumble. Books from early centuries of printing, made from rag paper with lower acid content, often survive better than those from later periods. Conservation became necessary. Deacidification treatments, climate-controlled storage, careful handling, all were needed to extend the life of printed materials. Some texts were reprinted when original editions became too fragile, though this raised questions about which edition to reproduce, how to handle known errors or variant versions. Digitization offered a new form of preservation, creating electronic copies that could be accessed without handling fragile originals. But this introduced new challenges: file formats that became obsolete, storage media that degraded, the need for ongoing migration to new platforms. Preservation was not a one-time act, but a continuing process. The labor relations of printing shaped broader labor movements. Print shops employed both skilled and unskilled workers. Compositors, pressmen, and proofreaders were skilled, their expertise acquired through years of training. Their labor was valuable, difficult to replace. These workers organized into unions, some of the earliest and most successful labor organizations. They negotiated wages, hours, working conditions. They went on strike when negotiations failed, halting production, demonstrating their collective power. The leverage came from their skills and from the difficulty of replacing them. An owner might hire strikebreakers, but untrained workers could not match the speed or quality of skilled compositors. The economic loss from reduced productivity or inferior work often exceeded the cost of meeting union demands. Print unions also controlled entry to the trade through apprenticeships. Sons of printers were given preference. Women were largely excluded, confined to limited roles as folders or bindery workers. These practices maintained wage levels by restricting the labor supply, but also perpetuated inequalities. The mechanization of printing changed these dynamics. Linotype operators needed different skills than hand compositors. The transition created conflict between those who had invested years in learning hand composition and those who saw opportunity in the new machines, between unions trying to protect their members and owners seeking to reduce costs through automation. Some unions negotiated feather bedding arrangements, requiring that hand compositors be employed even when linotype machines were used, their typeset and then melted without being printed. These arrangements slowed the displacement of workers, but could not prevent it indefinitely. The environmental footprint of printing grew with industrialization. Ink production used solvents that evaporated into the air or were discharged into water. Paper mills released effluent that affected rivers downstream. The printing process itself generated waste, spoiled sheets, worn type, used ink. Lead, a component of type metal, was toxic. Workers in type foundries breathed lead dust, developed lead poisoning, suffered neurological damage. Pressmen handling lead type absorbed the metal through their skin. The health effects were recognized gradually, protections implemented slowly. Wood pulp paper making required vast forests. Trees were felled, processed into pulp. The byproducts often burned or dumped. Reforestation was sporadic, often focused on fast-growing species that lacked the diversity of original forests. The landscape changed, shaped by the demand for paper. Recycling of paper and metal developed partly from economic incentives. Waste paper could be repulped, used to make lower-grade paper. Worn type could be melted and recast. Scrap metal from press repairs was salvaged and sold. These practices reduced waste but did not eliminate environmental impact. Regulations emerged slowly, typically after problems became undeniable. Water quality standards limited what could be discharged. Air quality regulations restricted emissions. Worker safety laws required ventilation. protective equipment, exposure limits. Compliance was uneven, enforcement often weak. The aesthetic dimension of printing evolved throughout its history. Early printed books imitated manuscripts using similar typefaces, similar layouts, similar decorative elements. This was partly market-driven. Readers accustomed to manuscripts expected books to look a certain way, but printing allowed new possibilities. Typefaces could be designed specifically for the printed page, optimized for legibility, for beauty, for character. Designers created fonts that became classics, used for centuries, their proportions studied and admired. Page layout became an art. The relationship between text block and margin, between type size and leading, between the recto and verso pages, all were considered, adjusted, refined. Some designers favored symmetry, classical proportions derived from mathematical ratios. Others embraced asymmetry, dynamic layouts that guided the eye through the page. Illustration integrated with text created visual narratives. The placement of images, their size relative to text, the flow from one element to another. These choices shaped how readers experienced the book. A well-designed book was a pleasure to read. The design, invisible yet essential. Typography became a profession, distinct from printing itself. Type designers created new fonts. Book designers specified typefaces, layouts, materials. Their work was judged on both aesthetic and functional criteria. Not just how it looked, but how it read, how it held up to use, how it served the text's purpose. Experimental approaches to printing pushed boundaries. Concrete poetry used typefaces and layout as part of the poem's meaning. The visual arrangement inseparable from the words themselves. Artists' books treated the book as an art object, experimenting with materials, structures, the relationship between content and form. Small press publishing allowed for experimentation that commercial publishers would not risk. Limited editions, unusual formats, content that challenged conventions. These found homes in small presses operated by individuals or collectives committed to particular aesthetic or political visions. The economics of small press were precarious. Sales were limited. Distribution was difficult. Financial sustainability was rare. Yet these presses preserved diversity, published voices that mainstream publishing ignored, kept alive traditions that might otherwise have disappeared. The relationship between printing and political power was never simple. Authorities sought to control printing to control information, to prevent the spread of ideas they deemed dangerous. Yet printing was also used by those authorities to disseminate laws, to publish edicts, to project power through printed documents. Licensing systems attempted to regulate who could print, what could be printed. Printers might be required to post bonds, to register with authorities, to submit to inspections. Violations could result in fines, confiscation of equipment, imprisonment. But enforcement was always incomplete. Unlicensed presses operated in secret. Prohibited books were smuggled across borders. The multiplicity of jurisdictions Different rules in neighboring cities or states created opportunities for evasion. Some printers became adept at reading political winds, adjusting what they printed to avoid trouble while maximizing profit. They developed relationships with authorities, obtained privileges, became semi-official printers. Others maintained independence, accepting the risks, valuing freedom to print as they chose. The tension between control and freedom, between censorship and expression, played out differently in different contexts. Some societies developed relatively robust traditions of press freedom. Others maintained tight restrictions. The printing technology was the same, but the social and political frameworks within which it operated varied enormously. Copyright law emerged partly from printers' interests in protecting their investments. A printer who invested in setting type, in editing a text, in producing an edition, deserved some protection against others who might simply copy the work and undercut the original price. Early copyright was more about protecting printers than authors. The author might sell their manuscript to a printer, relinquishing any further claim. The printer then held the exclusive right to produce that work, at least within a specific jurisdiction. Over time, authors gained more recognition, more rights. The concept of intellectual property, that an author owned their creative work, became established. Copyright became a balance between encouraging creation by protecting authors' interests and serving the public good by ensuring access to knowledge. The duration of copyright, the scope of protection, the exceptions for fair use, all were negotiated through legislation, case law, international treaties. Different jurisdictions made different choices, creating a complex patchwork of protections and exceptions. Enforcement required proving that copying had occurred, that the copies were unauthorized, that damages resulted. This was straightforward when someone printed a pirate edition of a popular book. It was murkier when the copying was partial, when ideas rather than exact words were taken, when transformative use was claimed. The business models of publishing evolved with technology and markets. Publishers balanced risk and potential reward. A book might sell well or might fail. Predicting success was difficult, based partly on the author's reputation, partly on the subject, partly on factors that defied analysis. Advances against royalties allowed publishers to secure works, giving authors income before publication. Royalties, a percentage of sales, aligned publisher and author interests, both benefiting when a book sold well. But the percentages, the accounting, the timing of payments, all were sources of tension and negotiation. Returns from booksellers complicated the economics. Booksellers ordered books on consignment, returning unsold copies for credit. Publishers had to estimate print runs without knowing how many would ultimately sell. Overprinting meant excess inventory, storage costs, potential remaining at deep discounts. Underprinting meant lost sales, dissatisfied booksellers, readers unable to find the book. Marketing became essential. Reviews, advertisements, author tours, all aimed to create awareness, to stimulate demand. The cost of marketing could exceed the cost of printing, especially for books with uncertain audiences. Bestsellers subsidized other books. A few titles with high sales generated profits that allowed publishers to take risks on unknown authors, on experimental works, on books with limited commercial potential but cultural value. This cross-subsidy was essential to the ecology of publishing, though it created perverse incentives, publishers chasing potential bestsellers, neglecting mid-list titles. The globalization of publishing created international markets, but also challenges. Translation was expensive, requiring skilled translators who understood both languages and the source culture. Rights had to be negotiated separately for each territory, each language. International copyright treaties attempted to create reciprocal protections, ensuring that works published in one country were protected in others. But compliance was uneven. Some countries ignored foreign copyrights, allowing local printers to produce unauthorized editions. This created market segmentation. A book popular in one country might be unavailable in another, or available only in pirated editions of variable quality. Publishers in different countries might compete to acquire rights, to issue translations, to serve local markets. The flow of books was not symmetrical. Works from dominant publishing centers, London, Paris, New York, circulated widely, translated into many languages. Works from peripheries were less likely to be translated, less likely to reach international audiences. This shaped what ideas circulated globally, what perspectives were heard, what was considered universal versus particular. The transition from print to digital is sometimes described as revolutionary, but the actual experience was gradual, contested, uneven. Digital text existed alongside print for decades before seriously challenging it. Early digital texts were difficult to read, confined to computer screens with low resolution, poor contrast. They lacked the portability of books, the tactile pleasure of paper, the ease of annotation. Reading on screen was tiring, uncomfortable for extended periods. E-readers improved the experience, using displays that mimicked paper, that could be read in sunlight, that did not emit light that disturbed sleep. Battery life extended to weeks. Storage allowed thousands of books in a device weighing less than a single volume. But e-readers introduced new frictions. Files had proprietary formats. Digital rights management restricted sharing, lending, resale. Concerns about privacy, what you read being tracked, data being collected, unsettled some readers. The economics of digital publishing differed fundamentally from print. Production costs were minimal, no paper, no printing, no shipping. Distribution was nearly free. Yet prices did not drop proportionally. Publishers argued that editing, marketing, author advances remained, that the cost of physical production was only part of total cost. Authors and publishers debated royalty rates for digital sales. Should they be the same as print? Higher because production costs were lower, or lower because prices were lower? The negotiations reflected deeper questions about value, about what readers were buying, about the role of publishers in a digital environment. Print-on-demand technology blurred the line between digital and physical. Books could be stored as digital files, printed only when ordered, eliminating inventory, allowing books to remain available indefinitely. A customer ordered, the file was sent to a printer, the book was produced and shipped. This enabled a long tail of titles, books with small audiences, backlist titles that had gone out of print, academic works with limited readership. These could remain available without publishers maintaining inventory, without risking capital on print runs that might not sell. Quality varied. Early print-on-demand books were noticeably inferior to offset printed books. Grainier images, less vibrant colors, rougher binding. But the technology improved. Digital presses approached the quality of offset for many applications at costs that made small runs economical. The existence of print-on-demand changed publishers' calculations. Books no longer had to go out of print when sales dropped below a threshold. Authors gained more leverage in contract negotiations, knowing that keeping a book available was less costly than it had been. The legacy of the printing press extends far beyond the physical books it produced. It shaped how knowledge was organized, validated, disseminated. It created expectations that information should be accessible, that claims should be verifiable, that ideas should be subject to scrutiny. The printed word carried authority, partly from its permanence, its fixity. A manuscript could be altered. A printed book was stable, each copy identical. This stability made citation possible, made scholarly discourse cumulative, made verification practical. Yet this stability also created rigidity. Errors in printed texts persisted. Outdated information remained in circulation. The printed word could ossify thinking, make it harder to revise understanding when new evidence emerged. Digital text is more fluid, more easily updated, more dynamic. But this fluidity creates different problems. How do you cite something that might change? How do you preserve a historical record when texts are continuously revised? How do you distinguish between versions, track changes, maintain intellectual integrity? These are not problems printing solved, but they are problems that printing shaped, that the transition from print to digital has made urgent again. Looking back across the centuries, the printing press was not a single invention, but an accumulation of techniques, materials, and practices. The cast metal type, the oil-based ink, the screw press, each built on prior knowledge, each refined through use, each part of a larger system. The impact was not immediate, but cumulative, unfolding over generations. The first printed books resembled manuscripts. Only gradually did printing develop its own aesthetics, its own possibilities, its own forms. The social changes attributed to printing, increased literacy, scientific advancement, political consciousness, were mediated by many other factors. Printing was necessary, but not sufficient. It created possibilities that required other conditions to be realized. And so we inherit a world shaped by printing, by the assumption that knowledge can be fixed in physical form, distributed widely, accessed by anyone who can read. This assumption is so deeply embedded that we rarely notice it, except when it is challenged by new technologies, new possibilities. The quiet assembly of the printing press, the smell of ink and paper, the rhythm of the pressman's work. These are distant now, memories preserved in museums, in historical accounts, in the occasional fine press that continues the tradition. But the ideas they enabled, the structures they created, the expectations they fostered, these remain, adapted to new media, continuing to shape how we create, share, and preserve knowledge. The pressman has left the shop. The type has been distributed. The press stands silent. But the words it printed continue to speak across centuries, across oceans, to readers who never saw the shop where they were made. Good night. And so, the narrative of this assembly comes to its quiet conclusion. Whether you are still awake, or whether you have already drifted into a deep and peaceful sleep, know that you are exactly where you need to be. The world is vast, but tonight, its systems are simply the backdrop to your rest. Thank you for joining me here at Quietly Made. Rest now. Join us again tomorrow. Good night.